Hello and welcome to another episode of Tea Time Trauma Talk with Brad. That's me, I'm Brad, and the tea today is a lovely herbal from South America called yerba mate. You may have heard of yerba mate, you may have tried it yourself. It's been around for a while. I've been enjoying this tea for about 25 years. Been buying it in bulk at local co-ops, and I like it. It provides mental clarity and some focus and some physical stamina, and helps with my metabolism, or at least with my appetite as well. So, yeah, give it a whirl. See what happens. And by the way, if you have any ideas for a John Waters type of segment where every time that I can drink tea I say something witty like John Waters would do, like he did with the old anti-smoking segments right before movies were to be shown in those independent movie houses. I remember them. They were good. So let's get started. What I would like to talk about today are a couple of things that fit together. I'd like to provide a model of complex PTSD, how that's different than shock trauma, and how that can be applied to maybe something that you've experienced for yourself. And then also some toxic relational characteristics I've been seeing in our culture in the past few years. I'm sure it's been there a while, but things that as a systemic mental health and substance use worker I see professionally, and I can't help but applying that perspective to our political and social context and seeing things a little bit different as a result. So let's start with this super fancy hand-drawn hand-drawn graph of complex PTSD. It's really straightforward. It's very general, but it's there to give an idea of how stress and the window of tolerance stress affects the window of tolerance, is what I should say, how that window of tolerance shrinks over time due to increased stress over time. All right, so let's take a look. So we're looking here at the x-axis, or the vertical axis, and that's our stress level. Starting down at the very bottom is low stress or no stress, and then increasing, ever increasing, until you reach that red line across the top, and that is your traumatic stress level. So all of this time I've been talking about traumatic stress. That is a point along the stress spectrum that you reach in which your physiology changes, your cognition changes, belief systems start to change, your perspective of the world and yourself and how these two things interact. All of that changes when that traumatic stress level is reached. That's when the window of tolerance is obliterated and options are minimalized. All right, and then we look at the x-axis, which is our horizontal axis. That's just time moving forward. You got the blue line, that squiggly line, moving up through the chart. That is our stress response over time. So we start in the bottom left corner. We start at 0. We have a event number 1, stress response number 1. Stress response goes up and it reaches a natural peak. And then what would happen normally, or normatively, is that stress response, that blue line would go down and actually go back down to the x-axis. That would be resolving itself, going back down to, say it's the animal that chases the deer that gets startled and runs off and finds safety, and then goes back to eating grass because the startle response is then resolved and it's calm and just going back to doing what it does. We have the capacity for that too. However, when we live in environments that have repeated exposures to stressful events, this tends to happen. So we have stress response number 1, it's resolving, it's heading back down, but before it has an opportunity to completely resolve and go back down to its natural baseline, event number 2 happens. And that truncates that response. And then we have another response, which is number 2. You can notice that each of these responses going 1 through 6, actually all the way to 7, which isn't labeled, but they all have the same degree of response. So 2 is simply higher because the baseline from which it was launched was higher than the natural baseline. Number 2 will also go down when the stress is over, but before that has a chance to resolve itself as well, event number 3 happens, and then baseline B is initiated. Peak number 3 is achieved, that goes down, before that has a chance to resolve, event number 4 happens, and baseline C is resolved, or initiated, excuse me, and then you have a continuation of this. Here we only have 6 points. That's all I really wanted to take the space for. There is no stretch over time. The time between 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, it can be a week. It could be a matter of days. It could be a matter of hours. We don't really know. So this is a very, very general type of explanation. But as we see with points A, B, C, D, E, and F, that window between the baseline and the traumatic stress begins to narrow and narrow and narrow. And as those points get closer and closer, the amount of options to respond to stress decrease. And as you get to baseline F, you have point number 7, or event number 7, in which that sets the individual over the traumatic stress level. Whereas in shock trauma, you have event number 1, and the stress response goes all the way up past the red level. That's shock trauma. This is complex trauma. The tricky thing is, it's very difficult to know that this is happening unless you're aware of the characteristics of relationships or environments, situations in which this can happen. In families where a parent has a certain type of style, unhealthy style, over the children, and also over the mother, say it's the father over the mother. The child itself doesn't have to experience the adversity directly. It can experience the relationship of the mother and the father and experience that secondhand. This can definitely happen in adult, intimate relationships. And these stresses don't have to be the same type of stress over and over. It doesn't have to be physical abuse over and over. It can be verbal abuse, physical abuse, financial exploitation, lack of food. Whatever the stresses are, they compile and they compile. And they end up with a change of your physiology, your cognition, your behavior, all of that we've been talking about for the past few episodes. So that is complex trauma in a nutshell. It's a little more complicated than that, but I hope that provides a good general overview of what you or someone you know might be dealing with. You can look at your own childhood and go, oh, well, I see this. I don't think that was so bad. I mean, I didn't have any really obvious events that happened, but maybe I see that I lived with a lot of what they call little t traumas in complex trauma. Lots of little t traumas that add up to the impact of a big T trauma, which is the shock trauma, the single moment in time. So, did you live with complex trauma? Did you live with little t traumas that added up? And that can be something that you're experiencing today in the light of all of our culture, today with COVID-19. And if we take a look at, excuse me a sec here, thank you. If we look at some characteristics of toxic relationships, we might be seeing that, wow, what I experienced in childhood or what I experienced in previous relationships is showing up, but on such a grand scale that it's not so easy to identify. It might be easier to identify on a smaller, more intimate, one-on-one type of relationship, but when you're talking about the entire country and you start throwing politics into it, and it's definitely there in our political culture, there's no doubt about it. I know that I'm responding to it on a political level, and as someone who has an undergrad degree in political science, did some good political advocacy work and some civic advocacy work a number of years ago. I do still consider this on a political level to be quite toxic. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of a toxic relationship. And maybe this will help clarify for you as well. So we look at number one. There's 11 points, and they're not in any particular order, and this is definitely not the only 11 points. In fact, there were 12, but I merged two together for sake of clarity. I don't know if it worked. But we start with number one, lack of healthy boundaries. I think with a toxic relationship, that is probably the most obvious. So the identified toxic individual in the relationship, and there could be two, but let's just stick with one to make things easy. One person who has a distinct lack of respect for boundaries, whether those boundaries even exist in the first place. But there are a lack of respect for boundaries and a lack of boundaries. No affirmation or safety. In a healthy relationship, an individual can look to the other and know that they're safe, that their existence is affirmed, that they are validated, and that they feel safe with that individual. Where might our lack of safety be showing up in our current social and political context? And how might that have shown up for you in relationship, intimate relationship? We have conditional attention or affection. This is where an individual will only provide attention or only provide affection for another in exchange for something else. You do this, and then I will give you attention, or I'll give you affection. I'll only love you if you do this, or if you're this way, or if you say these things to me, whatever it might be. There's overt, unnecessary criticism. Now, constructive criticism is one thing that we can learn by, but where are we seeing criticism that goes way above and beyond what is absolutely necessary and healthy? Where are we seeing that in our culture today? Where have you experienced that in your past? Motivation of others through fear and not respect. Now that fear is a motivator, there's no doubt about that, but people do not like to be coerced. Long-term healthy reciprocal motivation is only through respect. In toxic relationships, emotions are not appreciated. They are not allowed to be expressed. And for a child growing up in an environment like that, it begins to understand that my emotions are a threat to the attachment relationship and therefore my safety. If that's something that you experienced as a child and have not resolved that for yourself to date, it doesn't resolve on its own. So where in our society might you be seeing that, and how might you be responding to that outside of your adult, mature perspective of what's happening? There's definitely self-involvement and superficial concern, and what a lot of people out there call narcissism. We've been seeing that a lot over the past few years. But an individual, a toxic individual, will express concern on a superficial level and will only do that in order to manipulate the person to do something for the individual. We have behavioral justification. That person will say, well, I didn't have to do that if you didn't do that, or if you didn't say that, or if you weren't that way, I wouldn't be doing this. That same individual can demand that their own happiness is contingent upon another person doing this, that, or the other thing. Jokes can be fun, but far too often in toxic relationships we look at what we call barbed jokes, jokes that cut down and cut open. They definitely go well above what's appropriate. There's definitely control and manipulation in toxic relationships. No relationship should be about control. That has nothing to do with a healthy relationship. You can control and manipulate through shame or guilt or money. Through shame, that's a difficult one because we feel shame as early as 18 to 24 months of age. So we are babies when we are first experiencing shame. Now, shame is The way that I like to put it, that shame is the equation of our behavior with our value as a human being. So I did a bad thing, a child might think, especially at 2 years of age, I did a bad thing, so I am a bad person, right? This is non-conscious, in the gut, low-tone dorsal vagal activity going on there. The obverse of that is that to be a good person, from a shame perspective, to be a good person, you can only do good things, and that's impossible. So the internal push and pull of shame is very destructive. The last one is silent treatment. I think a lot of us have experienced the silent treatment, where in the midst of an argument, someone might just completely shut down. That toxic individual will shut down its communication or their communication. That's a ploy to regain the upper ground. And it is very, very common in toxic relationships. So I'd like you to look at all of these and consider, where do you see these in our current culture, and where have you possibly experienced these in your own life? And again, if you have experienced these in your own life, you can take all of these experiences and apply them to the complex PTSD graph. Point number 1 could be a lack of affirmation and safety. Point number 2 could be barbed jokes. Point number 3 could be unhealthy boundaries. Any of these, they don't have to be the same one over and over. They can be any variety of these. I hope that this helps you understand that when people are out there talking about what we're experiencing as a trauma, which I still argue that we're experiencing a collective adversity and not a trauma, because as long as we know that these things are happening right now, I can identify them out there, or I can identify them in my personal history, and that I'm responding at a deeper level to what's happening out there. You can maintain power and nurture your power over your responses to the event. And trauma doesn't have to be a byproduct of what we're currently experiencing. Another thing, even if you are not experiencing firsthand what's going on currently in our culture, but you identify with a person or a group of people who are experiencing these things, because of your identification, you feel that as well. You feel the injustice of people that you identify with, whether it be through gender or race or sexual orientation. So any of the overt homophobia or sexism or racism that's happening in our culture right now, even if you aren't personally experiencing it, you know other people that are. So you read in the paper or online of these things happening, or you hear about it on the news. It is affecting you. That's how identification works with our social groups. We don't have to experience it firsthand. And if you are working on your trauma from the past, you are working on healing yourself, stick with it. What's happening in our culture right now may slow down your progress. It's not going to stop it. As long as you're aware, it might slow it down. And this isn't a race to begin with. I always recommend that people take as slow and long as they want and need to heal. But do keep in mind that this has the potential to derail if you're not aware of it. So awareness and skills are fundamental in all of this. So let's do one last skill. We did EFT tapping a couple of episodes back. I'm going to do a shorter version. It only takes about 5 minutes to do 2 rounds, but I'm only going to do 1 round. I'm only going to do that round about half as long. So usually I do 2 phrases and do the whole thing twice. That takes 5 minutes. I'm going to do 1 phrase and do the routine once. And so I'm been considering what my new phrase is going to be. Again, I take my glasses off because I got to tap my face. So I allow myself strength in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. Okay. Okay, here, 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 down here below the armpit. Can't quite see there, but down there below the armpit too. And on top of the head. Okay. Nice deep breath. Using both hands. Begin. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. I allow myself strength and awareness in toxic culture. Nice deep breath. Getting that nervous system reset. Good stuff. You know what also helps in getting the nervous system reset? Yerba mate. I hope this was helpful. I hope this has provided some clarity and some much needed information for you. Again, just consider what's happening today, how that might fit into a previous history. If you're resolving the previous history, then continue to provide, to give yourself the time and the patience and the compassion to keep healing, and don't let any of this derail you. Don't let it wear you down. If you get worn down, then we don't want to know what's going to happen after that. You can keep strong. There's no reason to give in. All right, so I wish you peace, I wish you happiness, and I wish you safety. Take care.